stranger set a watch on the table between us, a Seiko, old. The crystal scratched along one edge, in the specific way that happens when a watch has been worn through years of actual work rather than decoration. The leather band was worn thin in the clasp. The color faded from whatever brown it had originally been into something closer to the color of old paper. It sat on the table between our coffee cups, like a question I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't seen that watch in 32 years. The last time I'd seen it, it was on the wrist of a woman named Sandra Maddox in a parking lot in Houston, Texas, on a cold January morning in 1992. 3 months after that morning, Sandra Maddox went to federal prison. She served 26 years. She never cooperated with prosecutors. She never gave them the name they wanted most. She never gave them mine. "My name is Jesse Maddox," the stranger said. His voice was quiet and deliberate. The voice of a young man who has rehearsed this moment without letting the rehearsal show. "My grandfather left you $1.8 million. But before you decide what to do with it, he asked me to give you something first." He pushed the watch across the table with 2 fingers. I didn't touch it. "My name is Ray Cole. I'm 63 years old. I spent 30 years as a DEA field agent in Houston and Boston, and the assorted geography in between. The parking lots, the warehouses, the federal conference rooms, the places that don't have names on maps but have permanent addresses in the memory of men who worked them. I retired with a clean record, a service combination, and a handshake from the regional director who told me I was one of the best he'd seen. I retired with a secret I had been carrying for so long, it had become part of my posture. The way I sat, the way I held my coffee, the particular angle at which I looked out windows when a conversation got close to something I'd spent 3 decades making sure no conversation ever reached. In 1992, I built a federal operation that was legally sound and morally wrong. I built it with precision, and I built it on time. And I built it the way a craftsman builds something he knows will last. Carefully, thoroughly, without visible seams. A woman named Sandra Maddox walked into that operation and went to prison for 26 years. A man named Miguel Ruiz walked into it beside her and lost the years that should have been the best of his life. I told myself I was doing my job. I told myself that was different from doing it. I was lying. I had been lying. With great consistency and considerable skill for 32 years. The morning Jesse Maddox sat across from me in a coffee shop in South Boston and set a dead man's watch on the table between us was the morning that particular lie ran out of way. What followed was the most dangerous situation I'd been in since I left the DEA. Not because of the men who watched us from parked vehicles across 3 cities. Not because of the network of former federal agents who had spent 2 decades making sure the truth about 1992 stayed exactly where they'd buried it. Not because of the dead man's inheritance, or the DOJ investigation, or the 73-year-old retired cop living alone on the Texas Gulf Coast who had been waiting 11 years for someone to come from his field notes. Because of what I was going to have to say out loud when it was over. Jesse Maddox didn't come for revenge. He didn't come for the money. He came because a careful, thorough, unhurried man named Edward Maddox had spent the last 5 years of his life building something more durable than a grudge. And he'd sent the person he trusted most to deliver it to the one man who needed to receive it. He came for the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was more complicated and more costly and more necessary than anything I had spent 32 years preparing to defend against. My name is Ray Cole. This is what I did. This is what it cost. And this is the story of what happens when the past decides, with or without your permission, that it is done waiting. The coffee was flat, and the harbor was gray, and I had nowhere to be, which was still something I hadn't gotten used to after 6 months. I sat at the kitchen table with 3 folders spread in front of me. Old case files I had no business keeping. Technical property of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Practically speaking, the property of a man who no longer existed. I'd walked out of the DEA's Philadelphia field office on a Tuesday in October with a cardboard box, a retirement badge, and 30 years of muscle memory that nobody wanted anymore. The folders had come with me. I told myself it was habit. That was mostly true. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on West Broadway in South Boston. Corner unit, windows facing the harbor. I'd chosen it for the sight lines. You could see the approach from 2 directions, which was the kind of thing that stopped mattering the day you retired and apparently never got the message. The place was clean, spare. A couch I'd bought at a second-hand store on Columbus Avenue. A kitchen table with 4 chairs I only ever used one of. Bookshelves I'd filled with case studies and procedural manuals because I didn't know what else to put them. A life that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of something. From the inside, it felt like the end of everything else. I did that sometimes. Looked down expecting to see something there and found nothing. I'd worn a watch every day for 30 years. A habit that ended in the winter of 1992 for reasons I didn't discuss with anyone, including myself. The pale strip of skin where a watch band used to sit had long since faded back to match the rest of my arm, but I still looked. Some absences leave a mark that the skin forgets before the mind does. I pulled the Hernandez file closer. Missing person, 2003. Gone cold before I ever caught the case. I worked it the same way I worked every cold case in retirement. Methodically, without urgency, following threads that had nowhere left to go. It kept my mind from doing other things.
Alo anh ơi, em sẽ nhấn mời
That
em
was
lấy
the
cái đơn đi
whole
Vương Thừa
point.
Phú ơi.
The mail came at 10:15. I heard the slot open and
trước cửa đấy
close
rồi.
from the kitchen.
để
Finished my
người ta lấy nhé.
coffee, rinsed the cup, and walked to the door. Bills. A catalog for outdoor equipment I'd never ordered from. And an envelope with a Providence, Rhode Island return address I didn't recognize. The name in the upper left corner read Callahan and Associates, attorneys at law. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. Thick envelope, quality paper. The kind of envelope that contained documents, not correspondence. I set it on the kitchen table next to the Hernandez file. Then I poured a 3rd cup of coffee and sat back down. The envelope stayed where I'd put it. I looked at it twice while I was reading through a witness statement from 2003, and both times I looked away again. 30 years of federal law enforcement teaches you that envelopes from lawyers you've never heard of are rarely good news. They're the kind of thing you open when you're ready. And readiness, in my experience, has very little to do with timing and everything to do with noon. I wasn't ready at 10:30. I wasn't ready at noon. I ate a sandwich at the kitchen table with the envelope 18 inches from my plate and read through the rest of the Hernandez file without retaining much. By 9 that evening, I still hadn't opened it. I went to bed with the envelope on the kitchen table. Lay in the dark for a while listening to the harbor traffic. The low horn of something big moving in from the Atlantic. The smaller sounds of the channel. South Boston at night had its own particular quiet. Not silent, just settled, like a city that had made its peace with whatever it was. I slept badly, which wasn't unusual. In the morning, the envelope was still there. I made coffee. Stood at the window for a while, watching a container ship work its way toward the Conley terminal. The sky was the color of old pewter, the kind of April morning that couldn't quite decide whether it was still winter. I watched the ship until it was clear of Castle Island. Then I sat down at the table, picked up the envelope, and opened it. The document inside was 6 pages, single space, on letterhead that matched the return address. I read the first paragraph twice. Then I set it down on the table and looked at the heart and a state notification. A man named Edward Maddox of Providence, Rhode Island, had died on the 14th of March, age 76. No surviving immediate families, except a grandson named Jesse Maddox. included a residential property, various personal effects, and a sum in liquid assets. The sum was $1,800,000. My name appeared in the distribution section. Not Jesse Maddox's name. Mine. Ray Cole, formerly of the Drug Enforcement Administration, currently of West Broadway, South Boston. I read the distribution section 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly.
Sang
I
em
had
xin
never
chào,
heard
em
of
Quỳnh Anh
Edward
phải không?
Maddox. I had never been to Providence. I had no connection to Rhode Island that I could account for, and no reason a dead man I'd
để
never
chết
met should be leaving me nearly $2 million. At the
Em đợi anh
bottom
tí
of
nữa.
the distribution page, below the legal language about probate proceedings and
Ok,
estate
lên đi.
taxes, and the contact information for
Cái
Callahan.
ký túc xá là đi vào trong này có y luôn nhỉ?
Someone had added 4 words in
Đi nhá.
handwriting that didn't match the typed document. The ink was different, darker, written separately after the fact by someone who wanted to make sure the words weren't lost in the legal language around them. 4 words. Now you go. I sat at the kitchen table in South Boston with my coffee cup and read those 4 words until they stopped looking like words and started looking like something else entirely. Something I recognized. Something I'd been waiting 30 years to see. 3 days passed, and I didn't call. I didn't research Edward Maddox. I didn't do much of anything except sit with the envelope on the kitchen table and wait for it to start making sense. 30 years of federal work had taught me that unexplained money was never actually unexplained. Somebody would always know the reason. The question was whether you wanted to be the person who found out on the morning of the 4th day. Someone knocked. Not the buzzer from downstairs. The door itself. Which meant someone had got into the building and walked up 3 flights without announcing themselves. I stood in the kitchen and identified 2 things immediately. First, it was not the knock of someone angry or urgent. Second, it was the knock of someone who had been standing outside for a while before deciding to announce themselves. I was at the door in 4 seconds. The man in the hallway was mid-30s, dark hair that needed cutting, the kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes rather than on the face. He wore a gray jacket that had been good quality once. No visible weapon, no aggressive stance. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at me with the stillness of someone who had decided exactly how this moment was going to go before he got here. In my left hand, he placed a watch, not held out for me to take. Simply placed there, the way you set something down on a table, with finality, without ceremony. Then he stepped back and waited. I looked at the watch, a Seiko, the kind they sold at drugstores, nothing a collector would look at twice. The crystal was scratched in 2 places, a long diagonal mark across the face and a smaller chip near the 4 o'clock position. The leather band had been replaced at some point, the new strap slightly darker than the original. On the case back, barely legible, serial number 7248861. I knew that number, the way you know a combination you haven't used in decades. Not because you've been thinking about it, but because some things bypass memory and go straight into the body. 3 seconds passed. My mother wanted you to have this back, he said. My grandfather made sure of it. What's your mother's name? I said. Sandra Maddox, he said. I stood in the doorway and said nothing for a long moment. Then I stepped back from the door. He came in without being told. Sat at the kitchen table, the chair across from mine, the one that never got used. He moved through the space like someone who had thought about this room before arriving. I filed that away and didn't address it. Not yet. His name was Jesse. Jesse Maddox. Edward Maddox and his grandfather. I set the watch on the table. Neither of us looked at it directly, the way you don't look at something generating too much gravity. Jesse reached and Jesse said carefully. Released in 2018, after 26 years. The sentence had been 18 years. I knew that number the way I knew the serial number on the watch. A fixed point I'd organized everything else around. The sentence was 18, I said. She wouldn't cooperate, Jesse said. They offered reductions 3 times. She refused every one. Xander Maddox had chosen to serve 26 years rather than sign whatever paper that they put in front of her. I knew what that paper was. I knew whose name would appear. Your grandfather, I said. How did he find it? He said he'd tell you himself. In the letter. Jesse nodded toward the envelope beside the Hernandez file. He asked me not to get ahead of it. I looked at the envelope, then the watch, then the photograph of the little boy in Houston. She knew, Jesse said quietly. She knew what was coming, and she didn't run. My grandfather spent 30 years trying to understand why. So did I. The harbor was doing its usual thing outside. A gull somewhere. The low pressure of a city going about its morning. I looked at a photograph of a house I hadn't thought about in years, and felt the floor shift under everything I'd built on top of that winter. Jesse set a second envelope on the table, smaller than the one from the lawyer. Personal stationery, soft with handling. My name on the front, in the careful handwriting of an old man who knew he wouldn't get another chance. I'll give you some time, Jesse said. He moved to the window and looked out at the harbor with his hands in his pockets, giving me the room without leaving it. I looked at the letter from a dead man I'd never met and thought about 15 seconds in a Houston parking garage in the winter of 1992. Those 15 seconds had never actually ended. They'd just been waiting for me to catch up. Jesse stayed at the window for a long time. I appreciated that. Most people in uncomfortable situations fill the silence. Jesse Maddox let it sit there, which told me something about him. Either he'd learned patience from someone who had a great deal of it, or he'd spent enough time in difficult rooms to know that silence wasn't the enemy. I picked up Edward's letter. The envelope was unsealed. He'd left it that way on purpose, I thought. No barrier, no ceremony, just words waiting to be read. I pulled out 3 pages of handwriting, the same careful script as the 4 words at the bottom of the lawyer's document, and started reading. Edward Maddox introduced himself without apology. Retired school teacher from Providence, Sandra's father. He wrote the way men of his generation wrote, plainly, without decoration, each sentence doing exactly one job before moving to the next. He'd been ill for 2 years before he died. He'd used that time, he said, to put certain things in order he'd known about Nancy for a long time. Not from Sandra. She hadn't told him directly, not for years. He pieced it together the way a careful man pieces things together, slowly, through documents and conversations, and the particular silences of a daughter who decided to carry something alone. By 2005, he knew enough. By 2010, he knew everything. was sitting in the chair across from me, hands folded, watching me with the same stillness he'd had at home. He wrote that to a man he never met, I said. He knew you, Jesse said. Not personally, but he knew you. He said there's a difference. I looked at the watch on the table, at the photograph of the little boy in Houston, at the letter from a man who had spent 30 years and $50,000 and whatever was left of his patience on the possibility that I was worth the trouble. I need to go to Houston, I said. Jesse nodded once, like he expected. I know, he said. Tom Garrett. I looked at him. I hadn't said Tom's name. Not once since Jesse had walked in. How do you know that name? I said. Jesse picked up his coffee, found it empty, set it back down. I told you, he said. I did my research. I didn't sleep that night. Jesse took the couch without being offered, which I didn't object to. I went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark listening to the harbor and thinking about Houston, which was something I'd spent 30 years learning not to do, and apparently hadn't been. The city came back to me in pieces. Not the whole of it, just the parts that mattered, parts that had calcified into something harder than memory. The smell of the place in winter, which wasn't cold the way Boston was cold, but had its own particular chill, damp and low-lying, the kind that got into your clothes and stayed. The width of the streets, the way the light fell flat and pale in February, no angle to it, just a general gray luminescence that made everything look slightly unreal. I'd gone to Houston in October of 1991 as Ray Calvin, insurance adjuster, which was the kind of cover that worked because nobody wanted to talk to an insurance adjuster. The target was a distribution network moving product through Houston. Mid-level operation, nothing that was going to end anybody's career, but solid work with solid evidence at the end of it. Tom Garrett ran the operational side. I handled surveillance and sourcing. Sandra Maddox had not been part of it. She worked at a bar on Westheimer Road called Rosie's, Tuesday through Saturday. And I'd gone in the first time because it was 2 blocks from the warehouse we were watching. And the coffee was better than anything else in the neighborhood. The second time I went in because the coffee was still good. The third time
Chú
I
có muốn
went
dừng ở cổng ra này
in
luôn
because
không
she
ạ?
was there. And I knew the difference between a professional reason and a personal one, and went anyway. That was my first mistake. We were careful, the way people are careful when they know they shouldn't be doing something, but have decided to do it anyway.
Có
She
2.000
didn't
chú ạ.
know what it actually did. I didn't tell her. We had 4 months that felt
Ê, chú đợi
the way
cháu
of
tí.
things that can't last, completely real. Dinner at places that weren't near the warehouse.
Ê, cháu cầm nhá.
Sunday mornings with the windows open. A Christmas that I told myself didn't count because I'd be gone in February. I gave her the Seiko the night before everything fell apart. It hadn't been planned.
Anh cháu gửi với 2 chục.
I bought it at a drugstore on Kirby Drive because her watch had stopped. She'd mentioned it twice. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a practical one, which was the only kind I knew. She'd laughed at the drugstore packaging and put it on immediately.
Cháu con nhá.
And I thought, standing in her kitchen on a Wednesday night in January, that I was going to tell Tom I was done. That I'd find another way to close the operation. That there were limits to what the work could ask of a person. I thought that for about 10 days. Then Ruiz got married. The details don't require response. An informant in a network like that one is worth exactly as much as his cover. And when the cover goes, everything goes with it. Tom called me on a Thursday morning, and we met in the parking structure on Polk Street, the one attached to the Federal Building, 3rd level, because it was the kind of place where 2 men could have a conversation without anyone wondering why. Tom had a solution. The solution had Sanders. She had peripheral contact with 2 of the network's mid-level people through the bar. Not operational contact, not knowing contact. Just the kind of incidental overlap that exists when you work in a neighborhood long enough. It was enough to build a case around if you built it a certain way. If you were willing to build it that way. had
Alo
it
hả?
for 41 years.
Các nhân xin chào, em ơi, ở cổng ra mình sẽ ra mắt đây, em ở đâu thế?
I told myself it was the work. That the network
Okay.
was worth more than one person's freedom. That Sandra's contact was real enough that she wasn't entirely clean. I was very good at that kind of thing. I'd been doing it for years, balancing what the mission required against what it cost. Always finding a way to make the numbers work. That was what you did in federal law enforcement. That was what separated the people who closed cases from the people who didn't. What I didn't account for was Sandra knowing. I found that out 32 years later, sitting at a kitchen table in South Boston, reading a dead man's letter. She had known what was coming, and she had not run. I didn't know why yet. That piece was still missing, sitting somewhere in the distance between here and Houston, waiting for me to come find it. I got up at 5 in the morning and booked 2 flights. When Jesse
Anh Ngọc à?
woke up, I was standing at the
Đợi cái
kitchen
mũ này.
window with coffee, watching the harbor go from black
Em lên xe đây.
to gray, to the particular color of an April morning that hasn't decided what it wants to be. We leave at noon, I said. Jesse looked at the 2 boarding passes on the table.
Anh đi nhá.
He didn't ask why I'd booked for both of us. I'll need an hour, he said. Jesse needed an hour. I needed 30 years. But an hour is what we had. So I used it. I went back to Edward's letter while Jesse was in the shower. Not the whole thing. Just the section about the bridge. The part I'd read twice the night before and needed to read again in daylight, when the words would mean the same thing they'd meant at 4 in the morning, and I'd know I hadn't misunderstood. I hadn't misunderstood. Tom Garrett had taken the watch from Sandra's attorney in March of 1992, 6 weeks after the arrest. He'd told the lawyer it was federal evidence. The lawyer had believed him, because lawyers believe federal agents, generally speaking, and because there was no reason to doubt a man in that position saying a routine thing. The watch went into Tom's possession and stayed there 26 years. I sat with that number the way you sit with something that doesn't fit the space you're trying to put it in. I had worked alongside Tom Garrett for 12 years. I had trusted him with operational decisions, with cover identities, with the kind of information that could end a career or start a prison sentence. I had considered him in the limited way that people in that work consider each other, a friend. And for the entirety of that time, he had been holding a $20 watch in a drawer somewhere, not because it was worth it, because I was. That was the part that required me to sit. Tom hadn't kept the watch as a souvenir or out of sentiment. He kept it because it was the one piece of physical evidence that connected me personally to Sandra Blandings. Not professionally, not operationally, personally. A watch given by one person to another person, with a serial number that could be traced to a purchase in a drugstore by a man operating under a cover identity in Houston in January of 1992. If that watch ever surfaced in the wrong context, Tom had something. He never used it. Probably never intended to. That wasn't the point. The point was that he had it, and I didn't know it. And that asymmetry had been sitting underneath our entire professional relationship, like a fault line neither of us ever acknowledged. Edward Maddox had paid $50,000 to correct that asymmetry. I folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Jesse came out of the bathroom with his hair down, jacket over his arm, and looked at me in the way he'd been looking at me since yesterday. Like he was checking something, verifying something, running me against a set of measurements he'd brought with him from Providence. Ready? He said. One thing first, I said. How long did you research before you came to my door? Jesse pulled his jacket on, taking his time with the buttons. 18 months, he said. What did you find? Enough, he said. It was the same answer he'd given me the night before, and I let it go. I didn't let it go this time. Jesse, I said. He looked at me directly. I found what anyone could find if they looked long enough and knew where to look, he said. I knew before I knocked on your door. Then you know what I am, I said. I know what you did, he said. That's different. I looked at him for a moment. It was the second time he'd made that distinction, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I picked up my jacket and my keys, and we went downstairs. The sedan was gray, mid-sized, domestic. It was parked on the opposite side of West Broadway, with two wheels on the sidewalk, which was either bad parking or deliberate positioning for a fast exit. I noticed it the way I noticed everything on the street, automatically, without deciding to, and filed it away without breaking stride. Jesse noticed me noticing. That car was there yesterday morning, he said quietly. I know, I said. Is that connected to Tom Garrett? Probably, I said. Get in the cab. We had a car service booked early. I watched the gray sedan in the rear window as we pulled onto West Broadway. It didn't follow immediately, which meant either it wasn't surveillance or it was very good surveillance. In my experience, the people who didn't follow immediately were usually the more dangerous kind. At the airport, through security, at the gate, I kept Jesse in front of me and slightly to the left, the position that gave me the clearest sightline to the approaches without being obvious. Jesse didn't comment on the positioning. He bought a coffee, found a seat with his back to me, and waited, done naturally, without being told. I sat down across from him. Your grandfather teach you that? I said, nodding. Jesse looked mildly surprised. Then no, he said. I just prefer not having people behind. Where'd you live? It was quiet. Then, same place you did, probably. The harbor. The boarding call came 20 minutes later. I picked up my bag and thought about Tom Garrett and his house in Sugar Land, with his clean lawn and his new car, and 32 years of someone else's watch. He was going to know it was coming. People like Tom always did. I boarded the plane and Tom Garrett's house was exactly what I expected. Single story, Sugar Land subdivision. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn was the same shade of green, and every driveway had a vehicle that cost more than a penny. His was a black pickup, current model, parked at a precise angle that suggested he'd thought about how it looked from the street. Tom had always been like that, attentive to appearances in small ways that added up to something larger. I left Jesse at the hotel 2 miles away, with instructions to stay off his phone and keep the curtains closed. He'd looked at me with that measuring expression he had and said, fine, which I took to mean he understood the reasons without needing them explained. The drive to Tom's house took 7 minutes. I rang the bell at 10:45. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd seen me coming, through a window, through a camera, through a call from someone watching the hotel. He was heavier than I remembered, the weight of a man who'd stopped being careful about things he used to be careful about. His hair had gone fully white, but his eyes were the same as they'd always been, pale gray, quick, the eyes of a man who was always doing math. He looked at me for 2 seconds without speaking. Ray, he said, calm.
Vậy thì điểm xanh mất.
Stepped back.
Anh quên con cài trên màn
The
hình.
kitchen was large and clean. He had a coffee maker that cost more than my first car, and a breakfast table with 4 chairs. And we sat across from each other the way we'd sat across from each other in 100 operational briefings over 12 years. Except that this time, there was no case file between us, and no shared objective. How long have you been in town? He said. Long enough, I said. He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. The Maddox boy came to see you. His name is Jesse, I said.
Đây đây
And
cái mã.
yes, Tom
Cái
wrapped
mã đây.
both hands around his coffee cup. It was a gesture I
28.
recognized. Something to do with his hands while he
Anh
thought.
cầm cho.
Ray, whatever Edward Maddox told you in that letter, he told me about the watch, I said.
Okay, cảm ơn.
Still, not dramatic, just a small cessation of movement, like a clock stopping between ticks. His hands stayed around the cup. His eyes stayed on the table. 3 seconds passed before he looked. That was a long time ago. 26 years is a long long time, I said. 32 is longer. It was operational security, he said. The watch was a physical connection between you and the target. I was protecting the mission. You kept it until 2018, I said. The mission closed in 93. Tom set his cup down. The small sound of ceramic on wood was very loud in the kitchen. What do you want, Ray? I want to know who else knew, I said. Beyond you and me. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Tom had always been hard to read, but enough. He stood up from the table and walked to the window above the sink, looking out at the backyard with his arms crossed. It was the posture of a man who needed distance to say what he was going to say next. You open this up, he said. You don't just burn yourself. You understand that. There are people who have a significant interest in 1992 staying where it is. People, I said. People who are not going to sit quietly while a retired agent and a dead man's grandson go digging through sealed operational records. He turned from the window. People who have been watching you since the Maddox boy showed up at your apartment. I looked at him. The gray sedan, I said. Tom didn't confirm. He didn't need to. How many? I said. Ray. How many people? He looked at me for a long moment with those pale gray eyes. Enough, he said. Go home. Let this go. Sandra Maddox made her choices. What happened in 92 is done. There is nothing to be gained by. My phone buzzed on the table between us. Text from Jesse. I'd given him the prepaid number before I left the hotel. 3 words. Someone outside. Watching. I stood up. Tom watched me read the message. He didn't ask what it said. Which meant he call them off, I said. I can't call off when I'm not running, Tom said. I looked at him across the kitchen. At the man I'd worked alongside for 12 years. The man who built himself a quiet life in Sugar Land on the foundation of things that were supposed to stay buried. He believed what he was saying. He believed the past was something you could manage if you were careful. He never understood that the past doesn't need managing. It just needs time. I picked up my phone and walked out of Tom Garrett's kitchen without another word. Behind me, I heard him say my name once, quietly. The way you say someone's name when you know you're not going to stop. He was right about that. I was already calling Jesse. The phone rang twice before Jesse. Where are you? I kept my voice flat. 30 years in DEA field teaches you one thing and everything else. Panic is contagious. It travels through phone lines the same way it travels through blood. Fast, invisible. Room 214, Marriott, West Hollywood. A pause, tight control. This black Ford F-150, Texas plates, parked across from the hotel entrance since I checked. Same troubles outside Edwards' lawyer's office in Providence last week. Process that in space is not a tape. Someone had to follow Jesse to Houston. They don't know what was happening. A tail means reactive. A fixed position means predictable. That distinction had saved my life twice in 1994 and got 3 of my informants killed when I confused the two. I wasn't going to confuse them again. How long since the jump? Before I knew. It was already there when the cab dropped me over, which meant they had his identity. Checking. That wasn't surveillance. That was intelligence. Someone in Providence had fed them the information before Jesse ever did. Don't open the door for anyone, I said. Housekeeping, front desk, a man claiming to be hotel security. Nobody. Keep your phone charged. I'm 12 minutes out. Outside Tom Garrett's house, the Houston evening sat on my shoulders like a wet blanket soaked with blood. 91 degrees at 7 in the evening. The kind of heat that doesn't break. It just waits. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain that had never arrived. I drove the rental hard through Sugar Land traffic, running numbers in my head the way I Tom's face in the kitchen told me something I was still digesting. When Jesse's text came through, Tom hadn't been surprised. He'd confirmed. There's a difference between a man reacting to new information and a man receiving a status update he already expected. Tom was the latter, which meant Tom wasn't running this. He was informed. Passive knowledge, not operational control. He'd called someone after I left, or someone had called him. Either way, the clock had started moving the moment I walked out his front door. I parked 2 blocks north of the hotel and walked the rest. Never drive directly into a location when you suspect active surveillance. Give yourself approach to it. Give yourself eyes on the terrain before the terrain has eyes on you. The F-150 was exactly what Jesse said. Black, curved, tinted windows, Texas plates ending at 84 engine on, one occupant, male, single, everything you know about the old dogs. He opened his mouth. 3 slow knocks on the door. 3 slow knocks. Not the pattern I'd given Jesse. Not housekeeping. Too deliberate. Too spaced. 3 knocks with exactly 2 seconds between each one. The kind of cadence that says, I know you're in there, and I'm not in a hurry. I was on my feet before the 3rd knock finished. Old muscle memory, 30 years deep. Left hand to Jesse's shoulder. 1 firm push toward the bathroom. No words. He read it correctly and moved without a sound. I positioned myself to the left of the door frame, back flat against the wall, out of the sight line of people from either direction. Who is it? I kept my voice neutral. 4 paused. Pause. 4 seconds. Then, management. We have a noise complaint from the room next door. 3 problems with that. First, we hadn't made any noise. Second, hotel management knocks twice, fast. Standard hospitality protocol. Third, the voice had a flatness to it that I recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in decades. Not a Houston accent. Not Texas at all. Mid-Atlantic, scrubbed clean of region. The kind of deliberate neutrality that federal training produces. Former governor. Current private. Slide your card under the door, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then footsteps. Retreating down the corridor at a measured pace. Not running. Walking. Professional, communicating that he wasn't rattled, wasn't exposed, and would be back when the conditions suited. I waited 90 seconds before I moved. Jesse came out of the bathroom, looking steadier than I expected. He'd used the 90 seconds to recalibrate. I could see it in the set of his jaw. Edward Maddox had raised a careful young man. Sit down, I said. Tell me about the old dogs. Everything.
Phía trái đây chị nhỉ?
Start with how you know the name. He sat
Rẽ
on
vào
the
trái
edge
đây
of the
đúng không
bed and laced his fingers together. The same gesture I
Thì
realized
là
that
đến
Edward had
BD
used in the
23K3 đúng không ạ?
photograph I'd seen of him. A habit passed down
Nhưng mà đâu
not
địa chỉ
through
nhà cô
blood,
ấy. Địa
but
chỉ nhà
through
cô là
proximity.
K mấy?
Through years of
K3 đúng không?
watching a man think, Edward started
Dạ vâng.
tracking me in 2019.
Đúng rồi. Sắp đến rồi,
Jesse
sắp
said.
về nhà.
After he bought the watch from Tom Garrett. He said buying it back wasn't enough. He needed to understand the whole structure. Who Tom answered to. Who answered to them. And the old dogs are 7 men. All former DEA. All Houston Field Office. All active during the period 1988 to 1997. They've been operating as a private intelligence and enforcement network since 2003. Corporate clients mostly. Some limited. He paused. 2 of them are currently under federal consulting contracts. I let that sit. Federal consulting contracts meant access. Access to databases, to travel records, to rental agency manifests.
Rẽ đây.
It explained the GPS tracker.
Rẽ đây đúng không?
It explained how they'd had Jesse's itinerary before he'd landed. Names, I said. Tom Garrett is number 3. The man who runs the operation is named Dale Whitfield.
Đây rồi, K3 đây rồi.
He was Houston Field Office Supervisor from 1990 to 1995. Jesse looked at me steadily. You worked
Đây
the
rồi ạ. Đã đến
operations
rồi.
under him? I remembered Dale Whitfield.
K2, 3 và
Square hands, short sentences. The kind of supervisor who never raised his voice
Của cô
because he never
57.000
needed
quá.
to.
Để cho gì?
I remembered the way he'd signed off on the Sandra Maddox operation without reading the file completely. I'd thought at the time it was efficiency. Now I understood it differently. Who's number 1? I said. Jesse hesitated. Just briefly. A half-second interruption in his composure that he smoothed over quickly. But I'd spent 3 decades reading people in rooms like this one. And a half-second was
13.000.
enough. Edward didn't find
Chào
out,
cảm ơn.
Jesse said. Or if he did, he didn't write it down. He was lying. Not about everything. About that one specific point. I filed it and moved on. Whitfield uses former military for static positions. The mobile units are usually younger, private contractors. The F-150 driver is probably ex-military. The man in the Civic is probably contract. Edward taught me. A pause. He was very thorough. I looked at Jesse Maddox in the cold Marriott air and ran the calculation I'd been avoiding since
Thì thưa anh được mấy lốp
Edward had
rồi.
spent 5 years building a complete intelligence picture.
5 lốp rồi hả? 5 lốp là ngon rồi.
He bought back the watch for $50,000.
Anh đi từ mấy giờ? 14 giờ đi từ
He'd
sáng à?
left $1.8 million.
Ê,
to a
em đi
man
sau anh có
who
2 tiếng thôi, 12 giờ anh đi
and
rồi.
he'd sent his grandson, or the young man
Thế là đúng
Jesse
rồi,
called
thế anh mình đúng cái hiệu suất rồi.
into the middle of a live surveillance
Đây
operation
316.000
with
đây.
a careful briefing and a Seiko watch as his only visible credential.
Chạy cho bọn
That was
xanh
the
chứ.
behavior of a man running an
Nhà nào, nhà làm gì có,
operation with a very
nhà chỉ
specific
có ruộng
instinct.
thôi. Làm gì?
How do you know operational
À,
structure? I
đi mua
needed
xe cho
to
mình
know
đấy,
what
xe cho mình đây thì cũng ra
and
tiền
I
đây
needed
chứ.
someone I could trust, who still had access
Nó phải
to
bắn chuyến
federal
đâu thì mới-
systems. She answered on the second ring, fixed position
Nó phải
on the
bắn chuyến
hotel.
cho thì mới có
At
tiền, nhưng nó không bắn chuyến
minimum,
thì
two people, one static.
nó bắn nó con đẻ nó hết rồi.
F150 driver, holding the observation booth, feeding information up the
Đúng
chain.
rồi, bây giờ
One will inside the building,
ra lót tiền đây rồi
covering
mới
the
có khách.
lobby and the elevator,
Anh ở đây không có khách đâu.
ready to move when the static unit flag moves. That's the
Đúng rồi,
minimum
xe không về đâu.
configuration for a
Mới làm là thế,
professional
có khách đâu mà nó bắn.
surveillance. Budget outfits use 3. Serious ones use 5.
Thôi đi,
Jesse,
cứ đi quanh quanh trong phố
I said
thôi,
carefully.
đi ra đây.
How long did Edward
Ra đây là
know
đen đấy.
before he died? I was wondering when you'd call. Had you? 6 words. Carol Reeves hadn't
Đường
said
nào ta?
hadn't said it's been a long time or Ray, what a surprise. She'd said exactly what a woman says when she's been expecting a call and is mildly irritated it took this long to arrive. That was not the behavior of a grieving father settling with schools. A beat too long before the answer. We mentioned your name in 2020. Edward Maddox contacted me in March of 2020. Her voice was the same as I had known. Dry, precise, the kind of voice that doesn't waste its syllables. He'd found my name in DOJ crosswords for the 1993 Louise operation. He wanted to know if I'd kept any documentation of the Houston field office. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in 11 years. Carol Reeves, former DOJ investigator, retired in 2018, currently living outside of Santa Fe. Carol had run 3 joint DEA-DOJ operations between 1993 and 2001. More importantly, she was one of the few people from that era who had left clean. No consulting contracts, no private network, no debts to men like Dan Whitfield. The man in the lobby, I said. Gray coat. You recognize the type? Tell me about the variant, I said. What changed in 2024 that moved Edward's hand? Meaning they're cleaning house. Meaning they're eliminating exposure points. Yes, you knew I'd call, I said. Not a question. Who's the witness? I said. Dale Whitfield is dying, Carol said. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, diagnosed last February. His doctors gave him 8 to 14 months. Another beat. A dying man with federal consulting access and 30 years of buried operations tends to become a liability to the people around him. The old dogs have been in a quiet, internal reorganization since March. The name landed in the cold hotel air like a stone dropped into still water. The room felt smaller suddenly. The recycled air pressed down. I processed the geometry of that. Dale Whitfield dying didn't
Hello.
just mean the end of the man who'd run the Houston network for 3 decades. It meant
Chưa
a
em ạ.
succession crisis. And succession crises produce paper trails, internal disputes, and most dangerously, witnesses
Là gì
who
đây?
stayed quiet under the old arrangement and were now reconsidering their options. She knew, I said. Go ahead, I said. In November of 1991, 6 weeks before the operation, a Houston PD narcotics detective named Frank Avila
Ok nha, mua gì nhắn tin nhá. Hết đèn đỏ rồi, đi đây, nó phạt.
Avila had picked up street intelligence about a federal sting targeting Louise's crew. We warned her. Carol let that breathe. I have his feelings. I have the date, the location, and the content of the conversation. Ray. Pause. I sat down on the edge of the chair by the desk. Jesse was watching me from across the room, with the stillness of a young man who already knew this story and had been waiting to see how I'd receive it. She knew, I said again. This time it wasn't a question. It wasn't even surprise. It was the sound a man makes when 32 years of one story collapses and something harder and more complicated takes its place. Avila's notes indicate she told him she wasn't leaving Louise. Carol's tone was careful, precise. The way you handle something fragile without acknowledging its fragility. Miguel Ruiz wasn't just a crew member to her, Ray. He was the younger brother of her closest friend, a woman named Teresa Ruiz, who died of an overdose in 1989. Sandra had made a promise to Teresa before she died. She wasn't going to let Miguel face a federal operation alone. She made a choice, Carol said. A deliberate, informed choice. She protected Miguel Ruiz, and she protected her promise to Teresa. The 26 years she served, she chose them. In a moment, Carol's voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but more careful. The way a surgeon sounds when they're about to tell you the procedure is more complicated than they initially indicated. First, I need you to hear something about Sandra Maddox. She knew there was a sting. She didn't know the specific date or the specific mechanism, but she knew the general shape of it 6 weeks in advance. A pause. She stayed in it. I looked at Jesse. His face was composed, but his left hand had moved to the Seiko watch on his wrist. Not adjusting it, just touching it. The way you touch something that crosses you. Edward, Carol. Part of why Edward waited until 2024 to move was that he needed to know whether Sandra would authorize it. She was released in 2019. It took Edward 2 years to convince her to let him proceed. The pause this time was different. The kind that precedes information, that reorganizes everything you thought you understood. Sandra Maddox was alive. Now. And she'd given permission for this entire operation. The will, the watch, Jesse's journey to Boston, this conversation in a cold Houston hotel room. To happen. And Whitfield's cleanup operation. Francavilla has 72 hours, Carol said. Maybe less. Jesse knew, I said quietly. Not to Carol, to the room. Getting out of the Marriott without being seen is not a complicated problem if you've done it before. His name is Francavilla, Carol said. He's 73 years old and living in Corpus Christi. He's the only living person outside the old dogs who can corroborate the timeline of the 1991 warning. Which means he can directly contradict the official record of the Sandra Maddox prosecution. Pause. The old dogs know he exists. They've known for 6 months. The Silver Civic never knew. The F-150 never knew. The man with the newspaper was probably still performing stillness in the lobby. I used a cash transaction at a rental agency on West Highway. A different agency from the one the GPS-tagged car had come from, and had us on I-10 South toward Corpus Christi by 9:15. 3 hours and 40 minutes of Texas highway at night. The kind of drive that gives you nothing to look at and too much time to think. 4 years. Edward Maddox had known my name for 4 years and waited until he was dying. Which meant the timing wasn't grief. The timing was strategic. Something had changed in 2024 that had moved Edward's hand. Some variable that made now to send Jesse to Boston with a will and a watch, and now you own me, written in a dead man's handwriting. I had done it before. Twice in Bogota, once in El Paso, once in a budget motel outside of Laredo that smelled of bad decisions. The mechanics are consistent regardless of the place. You leave through an exit that isn't the one you're watching. You move at the pace of a man with nowhere particular to be. And you don't look at the people who are looking for you. Jesse was quiet for the first 40 minutes. Not uncomfortably quiet. The quiet of a man organizing his thoughts
wasn't wrong, I said.
I understood that he was telling me something specific without saying it directly. It was the same technique I'd used for 30 years in interrogation rooms. Lead the subject to the truth at an angle so they arrive there themselves instead of feeling pushed. Jesse had learned the same technique from Edward.
Jesse turned to look at me.
I could feel it without seeing it.
No, he said quietly. He wasn't.
I'd spent 32 years carrying the weight of Sandra Banners as a woman I'd helped destroy. A woman who trusted the wrong people and paid for it with 18 years of blood. 26 as it turned out, because she refused to cooperate with prosecutors who could have reduced her sentence. I'd built the architecture of my guild on a foundation. She hadn't known. She couldn't have known. She was a civilian caught in a federal operation she had no way to see. We didn't speak again for another hour. Something had shifted in the car. Not resolved. Shifted. The weight had redistributed into a shape that was easier to carry, or at least different from the feeling. I thought about what Jesse hadn't said, and what I hadn't asked for. And I decided that some truths don't require the confrontation. They just require the acknowledgement. The quiet between us on that dark Texas highway was a form of acknowledgement. It was enough. For now, it was enough. I parked the block and a half away. Same protocol as usual. Approach on foot. Read the terrain before you're inside. Corpus Christi at midnight smells of salt and diesel, and the particular loneliness of a Gulf Coast city after the tourists have gone. We found Frank Avila's address through Carol's notes. A small bungalow on Airline Road. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are close together and the yards run to chain link fences and old pickup trucks and driveways. The front door was not closed. The neighborhood was quiet. The houses on either side of Avalos had lights in their windows. Blue television glowed, a kitchen light, the ordinary illumination of ordinary lives running on ordinary schedules. Frank Avala's bungalow was dark. I stopped Jesse with one hand on his arm, 10 feet from the front wall. Not just dark, specifically dark. The kind of darkness that says the lights were on recently choosing not to. Jesse was in the doorway when I came back to the living room. He'd come in without being told,
Mưa đâu có mưa đâu
reading
anh.
the situation correctly, and deciding that standing alone on a dark front walk
Sáng
was
nay
a worse
mưa rồi
option
à?
than a minor protocol violation.
Sáng nay mưa to luôn.
I didn't reprimand him. I'd have made the same call. I stood in Frank Avila's bedroom and read the room the way I'd been trained to read rooms. Not looking for what was there, but for what was missing. The closet door was open. One section of the hanging rail was thin, where clothes had been pushed aside quickly, not taken. Pushed aside in the dark by a man who knew exactly which jacket he wore, and grabbed it without turning. A pair of dress shoes on the floor, aligned too neatly for a man. On the nightstand, a phone charger with no phone attached, a bottle of blood pressure medication, and a warm leather. Graphite shadows rose out of the paper, like a photograph. Him, I said. Jesse moved to the coffee table without speaking. He stood over it for a moment, then crouched to surface level, looking across it at a low angle. The kind of angle that catches impressions on paper and standing height misses entirely. He produced a short pencil from his jacket pocket, the disposable kind you pick up at a miniature golf course, and ran it flat across a small yellow notepad, half hidden behind the base of it. I called the front desk for Jesse's room phone and requested a cab to George Bush Intercontinental. Loud enough that if the room was wired, which I now considered a genuine possibility, the information would travel to the right ears. Then I took Jesse's bag and my jacket, and we walked to the third floor, crossed through the connecting corridor to the adjacent parking structure, took the elevator down to the basement level, and walked out through the service exit onto the side street. Miguel Ruiz, Jesse said quietly. He looked up at me from his crouch. Edward's files mentioned a Corpus Christi notation. He thought Ruiz might have been relocated here after his witness protection term ended. I went outside while Jesse combed hair. The Gulf Coast night was salt-heavy and close, the kind of hair that sits on your skin rather than moving through it. I read the street from the front wall with the patience of a man who has stood on too many dark streets to hurry the process. They'd anticipated Corpus Christi before we arrived, not the mayor. Different vehicle, different plate numbers. A leapfrog staged ahead of our route while the first team held the hotel and waited to confirm the direction of travel. The moment Jesse and I had moved south on I-10, someone upstream had made a call and repositioned the second team to the only logical destination. A man running from people with federal database access knows that credit cards are a trade, and cash from your own wallet is a trade. The fastest way to disappear for 12 hours is to leave both behind, and move on whatever cash you keep separate, the kind every retired cop keeps in an envelope taped behind a kitchen drawer. Frank Avila was 73 years old and still thought like a cop. 2 cars I hadn't clocked. One a late model Dodge, 3 houses down, engine cold, windows clear. Parked more than 2 hours, civilian. The other, a white panel van in the corner, and the panel van was wrong in the specific way that surveillance vehicles are wrong when they're trying not to be noticed. Texas commercial plates, rental designation in the third character position. Engine warm enough that the exhaust pipe carried a faint shimmer in the cool night air. Recent arrival. And positioned at an angle that gave the driver a sight line to Avila's front door without being directly in front of him. Who's the witness? I said again. My voice was steady. The recalibration was complete. The new geometry was ugly, complicated, and true, which made it manageable. Crabtrap Marina was 7 minutes away by road. I drove it in front. A boat, of course. A 73-year-old former narcotics detective with cop instincts and no wallet runs to water. Because water means exit options in multiple directions and no fixed address for a database to locate. I stepped onto the dock, knocked twice on the cabin frame. Frank Avila, my name is Ray Cole. Carol Reeves sent me 15 seconds of silence. The specific silence of a man deciding.
Stay here, I said.
If you hear anything, you call Carol. Not 911. Carol. The cabin door opened. Slip 14 held a 22-foot Gulf fishing boat. Anonymous. Working class. The kind of vessel that disappears into any Texas coast marina without drawing a second look. No name on the hull. Painted over recently from the uniform flatness of the stern. The cabin light was on, but the navigation light was burning. The small red and green markers throwing weak color across the dark water. The mistake of a man who moved fast and frightened and forgotten that a single light in a dark marina is a beacon to anyone who's looking. He looked at me, then passed me at Jesse. He brought himself, I said. He brought the boy, he said. Not to me, to the air between us. The words landed in the boat's small cabin, like something falling from a significant height. Avila was smaller than I'd imagined from Carol's description. The kind of physical diminishment that happens to men in their 70s when the body starts reclaiming what it once built. White hair, dark eyes that were sharp and frightened in equal measure. A flannel shirt buttoned one hole off in the dark. He held a coffee mug in both hands, the way a man holds something when his hands need an occupation. Avila studied Jesse for a long moment, the way you study a face you've seen in photographs and are now measuring against the You look like her, he said. Sandra's eyes exactly. He shifted his gaze to me, and the shift was deliberate. You know he's not your son. I know, I said. It was the first time I'd said it aloud. It felt less like a wound than I'd expected. It felt like the truth, which is a different thing entirely. Clean, cold, and in its own way, warmed. I need the documentation, I said. Whatever you have that corroborates the 1991 warning to Sandra. Avila nodded slowly. Edward told him 2 years ago. The boy chose to come anyway. He looked at Jesse with an expression that held sorrow and warm respect in roughly equal parts. Sandra knows he's here. She authorized every step of this. I took the envelope. Something moved across his face. Not quite recognition, but its immediate neighbor. White panel van just turned onto Shoreline Drive. 2 minutes out. Move. No wallet, no cards, I said. He took his phone. The charger's still warm. He left within the last 90 minutes. This wasn't planned. Something triggered, which meant 20 minutes. Maybe less. He reached back into the cabin without moving and produced a manila envelope. Thick, rubber banded. The edges softened from years of handwriting and occasional re-examination. Field notes in my original handwriting, dated November 14th, 1990. A digitized recording of my conversation with Sam. I had the original cassette converted in 2013. And a sworn statement prepared with a DOJ notary in 2022. He held it out with both hands, the gesture of a man transferring something that has been heavy for a long time. I've been waiting 11 years for someone to come for this. Not the boat, I said. They'll expect the boat. Jesse appeared at the doorway. Carol confirms it. Crab Trap Marina, Shoreline Drive, Slip 14. It's in Edward's files as a contact. Old cat. Regular use. South fence, I said. Now, I was not going to lose it in a parking lot in Corpus Christi. The marina's layout worked in our favor. Crab Trap was a working marina, not a tourist facility, which meant it had the functional geography of a place designed for access rather than aesthetics. 2 vehicle entrances, a dry storage yard in the north end, a bait house at the south dock that backed against a chain-link fence separating the property from the light industrial street. The fence was 8 feet tall and topped with a single strand of rusted wire that had been broken in at least 2 places visible from the street. Avila's breathing was audible. I put a hand on his shoulder. kept the manila envelope inside my jacket, left hand pressed flat against it. 32 years of documentation, field notes in a dead man's handwriting, a cassette recording digitized by a 73-year-old cop who'd been carrying this weight since before Jesse was born.
Fence, I said. I checked Carol's last text.
DOJ, contact activated. Diana Walsh. She's expecting your call within the hour. We've just become relevant to each other. Diana Walsh. I knew the name from Carol's earlier briefings. A current DOJ investigator who had been quietly building a parallel case against the Old Dog's federal consulting operation since 2022. She'd been waiting for the documentation that was currently pressed against my ribs in a rubber band envelope. Avila wrapped both hands around his mug and looked steadier than a man his age had any right to look after what the last 2 hours had contained. Whatever fear had driven him through his bedroom window and across 7 miles of dark Texas coastline had not dulled his reflexes. He grabbed a canvas jacket from the cabin and was on the dock beside me in 4 seconds. Jesse was already untying the stern line with the calm efficiency of a young man who had prepared for this possibility, which told me something about how thoroughly Edward Maddox had trained him. They'll find the boat empty, he said. They'll know I ran again. Let them know, I said. You're done running. I called a cab from Navigation Boulevard, and we rode it 3 miles north to a 24-hour diner on South Padre Island Drive. The kind of place that doesn't notice 3 men arriving by taxi at midnight because it has seen everything and remembered none of it. The corner booth, backs to the wall, coffee that tasted like it had been made before the current administration. He looked at me across the table, the careful eyes of a man taking a measure of sleep. You sound certain 2 minutes is longer than most people think. I'm sure, in 8 minutes. I am. I sat Carol's text on the table between us. DOJ has been building this case for 2 years. What's in this envelope completes it. Frank, after tonight, the only people running are the Old Dogs. Sandra Maddox had more courage than anyone in the city, including me. Jesse was quiet across from me, his coffee untouched. The Seiko watch, catching the diner's fluorescent light in a way that made it look older than it was. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Not quite relief, not quite something else. The expression of a young man who has been carrying a mission for a long time and concluded beyond its end. The highway stretched ahead of us to nothing. I thought about a woman who had known about a trap 6 weeks in advance and walked into it anyway to keep a promise to her good friend, who had served 26 years without cooperation, without reduction, without giving the prosecutors the name, who had then spent 5 years letting an old man named Edward Maddox build the case
anh này.
recognizing not his thoughts, but his willingness to speak. You didn't, he said. Not accusatory, observation. He'd made Jesse and Avila in the lobby, or on approach, or both. Tom Garrett had 30 years of the same training I had, and the same training tells you the same things. The kid and the old man. Smart positioning, elevator bank and the side entrance. He almost smiled. You taught me that configuration, Ray. 93, the Ruiz briefing. Dale gave the order in September, he said. Avila's name came up in an internal review. Someone in the network had cross-referenced his Corpus Christi address against the 1991 Sandra Maddox file. Whitfield decided he was an unacceptable exposure. Tom's voice was flat and precise. He asked me to him. You've been protecting him, I said. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Tom Garrett's number. I've been managing the situation, Tom said. The distinction mattered to him. I could hear it. There's a difference. Morning light came through the east window at a flat angle and lay across the table between us like something physical. I didn't. We looked up. I told Dale the timing was wrong. The risk was too high. The surveillance footprint was already too large. I gave him operational objections. He accepted it because he was sick, because I'd been his number 3 for 20 years, and he trusted my judgment. Pause. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been the one feeding Avila's location updates to Carol Reeves since March. Tom accepted that with a slight nod. No, I suppose not. A partial address, street number, and the first word of the street name. 4417 Shoreline. And below it, 2 words pressed harder than the rest. The handwriting of a man writing fast in low light. M still there. Whitfield has 3 lawyers and a federal consulting contract, he said. This won't be clean. Diana Walsh is downstairs, I said. She has the documentation. Avila's sworn statement, the field notes, the recording. It's complete, Tom. Whatever the old dogs built in 1992, it comes apart today. Tom was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Houston went about its morning without us. The silence stretched long enough to have weight. The Petroleum Club occupies the 35th floor of a downtown Houston tower. And at 8 in the morning it smells of fresh coffee, old money, and the particular confidence of men who have never seriously considered the possibility that they might be wrong. I understand it, I said. It wasn't enough. You know that. Tom picked up his coffee, found it empty, set it back down. The watch, he said quietly. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with the guilt. You understand that. Let's go, he said. He stood, straightened his jacket. The gesture of a man preparing to do something that cost him something. Yes. He said it simply, without self-pity. The admission of a man who had known a thing for a long time and was finally saying it in a room where it counted. I know that. The lobby doors opened. Where? Tom said finally. We rode the elevator down in silence. 35 floors, the city dropping away outside the glass. I thought about Sandra Maddox walking into a trap she could see coming. About Edward Maddox spending 5 years building a case for a woman who had told him he didn't need to.
101 thì sao?
About Jesse touching a watch on his wrist in a cold hotel room
101 anh ạ.
because some
Cái
debts
chuyển khoản
get
à?
paid, whether you intend them to or not. She looked at Tom Garrett for a long moment. Tom stopped walking. Diana Walsh was standing near the
Cảm ơn anh ạ.
entrance in a charcoal suit, a leather briefcase at her side. The composed stillness of a federal investigator who has been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Jesse and Avila were positioned exactly where I'd placed them. Elevator bank and side entrance. The configuration Tom had recognized from 30 years ago. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was even and clear. "Thank you for coming." It never is. I leaned forward slightly. But here's what it is. You talked to Carol in March. You protected Avila for 6 months. You refused a direct order from Whitfield. I held his gaze. That's not nothing. Walsh knows it. I made sure she knows it before I walked in here. A pause. You have a choice, Tom. You walk downstairs with me and you talk to Walsh on your terms, with what you did in the last 6 months on the record. Or you wait, and Whitfield's lawyers define you the same way they define everyone else, as a liability to be managed. Avila drank 3 cups of coffee and said very little, which suited me. There are situations that have been talked about enough and need only to be sat with. And the lobby of a Houston office building at 9 in the morning, after the night we'd had, was one of them. Diana Walsh took Tom Garrett's statement in a conference room on the building's 4th floor, with a DOJ recorder running and a court reporter present, and 2 federal marshals standing outside the door in the specific posture of people who are not expecting trouble, but are prepared for it. I sat in the lobby with Frank Avila and watched the morning traffic build on the street outside. Sandra Maddox, I let her look. Jesse was upstairs. Walsh had asked him to remain available for a preliminary statement. Not testimony, not yet, but a documented account of the chain of custody from Edwards' files to the manila envelope currently being logged into federal evidence. He'd gone without hesitation, the Seiko watch on his wrist catching the elevator light as the doors closed. Sandra Maddox sat across from me. I know, I said. I built the trap, I said. She was 61 years old, and the 26 years were visible in the way that time is visible, in people who have been through something that ordinary life doesn't prepare you for. Not broken, not diminished, but altered at a fundamental level, the way metal is altered. She sat straight, her hands were still in the light. She had the patience of a woman for whom patience had become structural rather than chosen. I looked at the man across from me, the 29-year-old who had taken notes in a Houston conference room, the number 3 in a network that had buried a woman's life under 32 years of operational silence, the man who had kept a dead woman's watch for 26 years and sold it back for $50,000 to settle a debt he couldn't settle any other way. Tom Garrett was not a simple villain. He was something harder to categorize, and in some ways harder to forgive. A man who had known the difference between right and wrong for 30 years and kept choosing the more comfortable distance. Walsh has everything she needs, I said. I'm not going to say most of it. She looked at me steadily. Not because I've forgiven you. I want to be precise about that. I haven't. What you did in 1992 cost me 26 years, and it cost Miguel his freedom, and it cost Teresa's memory the one person who was keeping it. A pause, clean and deliberate. But I made my choice. I walked in knowing the shape of what was coming. You didn't make me stay. He was right that it was necessary. Jesse looked at me. You're not going alone. Jesse told me about the watch, I said finally. I know. The first slight shift in her composure. Not softness exactly, but a fractional release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time.
Đường đông đông cầm nhau ngóc lên, cuốn chân cuốn tay, anh nên tất đè.
It wasn't necessary. We sat in silence for a while. The lobby moved around us. Businessmen, coffee cups, the ordinary percussion of a city morning. None of it touched the radius of our conversation. Sandra looked up. He showed me. I'll be alone, I said. He wore it from the first day. I paused. He wears it the way you wear something that costs you. I've thought about what I'd say to you, she said. Yes. No qualification. No softening. You built the trap, and I walked into it with my eyes open to protect someone I love. Those are both true at the same time. She looked at me with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 26 years thinking about something from every available angle. What I need from you isn't an apology, Mr. Cole. I need the record corrected. I need Miguel's name clear. I need Frank's statement on file and Tom Garrett's cooperation documented and Dale Whitfield's network dismantled. A pause. That's what Edward understood. That's why he sent Jesse.
She stood there, not abruptly, but with the finality of a woman who has said what she came to say and means to leave it exactly where she left it.
She picked up her coat from the back of the chair.
Mr. Cole,
She said, do what Walsh needs you to do. Make sure Whitfield's people are named and documented.
Đường đông đông cầm nhau ngập lên chuyện
Go
của
find
em
Miguel.
đơn đường
Sandra said carefully.
tâm
Edward's philosophy
vào
was correct.
có vô
Biology
ai
is the
gì đó
first draft. Everything after is the real version.
Something moved across her face. The expression of a mother recognizing her child being described accurately by someone who has no reason to be accurate. He's not yours, she said, but he chose this for you. That was entirely his decision. I want you to understand that. Edward told him the truth when Jesse was 22. Jesse had 6 months where he could have walked away from the whole thing. A pause. He didn't.
Not to Frank Avila, there isn't.
I looked up at her.
He's been in Corpus Christi for 8 months, she said.
Not witness protection. Just a man living near the water. He deserves to hear from you directly. Her voice was even and final. That's not for me. That's for you. And beside Diana Walsh, in a gray coat and flat shoes, hands folded in front of her with the patience of a woman who had learned patience the hard way across 26 years of concrete walls and institutional silence. She walked to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped inside.
She's right, you know, he said quietly.
About Miguel.
I picked up my phone and looked at it. Miguel Ruiz, Corpus Christi, near the water. I drove back to Corpus Christi alone.
Frank Avila set down his 4th coffee cup and looked at me across the lobby. One more drive. One more door. One more conversation I had been not having for 32 years, especially me. Jesse had offered to come. Avila had offered to come. I'd told them both the same thing, that this particular door needed to be opened by one person, and that person had a specific debt that couldn't be paid by proxy. They'd accepted this without argument, which told me that Edward Maddox had, in his thorough and unhurried way, prepared them both for this exact moment. I watched the doors close and sat with the specific weight of a conversation that had given me neither absolution nor condemnation, but something more difficult and more useful than either. A direction. The drive down I-37 was different from the night before. Daylight changes the geometry of Texas. The flatness becomes visible in a way that darkness conceals. The distance between things becomes honest. I drove with the windows down and the Gulf air coming through at 70 miles an hour. And I thought about 32 years of not doing this and what that accumulation had cost everyone involved, including me. I was done being that man. I parked in front and sat for a moment. A man who doesn't reckon with the things he's done doesn't escape them. He just relocates them, moves them from the front of his mind to the back, from the back to the basement, from the basement to a sealed room he tells himself he's forgotten the combination to. The weight doesn't decrease, it redistributes, and eventually you become a man shaped entirely by what you've refused to carry openly, bent into a posture you've stopped noticing because it's been yours for so long. I got out of the car and walked up the front path. Miguel Ruiz lived on Ennis Jocelyn Road, 4 blocks from the water, in a small white house with a concrete front porch and 2 chairs on it, and a portable fan running in the window, despite the mild April morning. The kind of house a man chooses when he wants to be near something he loves. Water, the wind of the Gulf, the quality of light that changes on a coast in a way it doesn't change inland. Upstairs, in a 4th floor conference room, Garrett was talking. Dale Whitfield's network was coming apart, name by name, account by account. 32 years of careful architecture dissolving into a federal record. It would take months. It would be incomplete in the ways that human things are always incomplete. But it was happening, which was more than it had been yesterday. In my DEA years, I had approached hundreds of doors. Informant doors, suspect doors, witness doors. The doors of people who were glad to see me, and the doors of people who were not. I had developed, over time, a professional equanimity about doorways, a functional detachment that let me knock without rehearsing what I'd say, because rehearsal produces performance, and performance produces distance, and distance is the last thing an interrogation room needs. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been expecting for a long time, and has made his peace with the waiting. He answered before I knocked. The door opened while my hand was still raised, which meant he'd seen me from the window and had been deciding whether to answer. The decision had taken approximately 45 seconds, which told me something about the quality of his deliberation. The Gulf wind moved between us. A car passed on Ennis Jocelyn, unhurried. Miguel Ruiz was 58 years old, medium height, the lean build of a man who works outdoors, silver in his hair, and a week of beard on his face. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and paint on his left forearm that hadn't come from this morning. He looked at me with dark eyes that were not hostile and not welcoming and not surprised. "Mr. Ruiz," I said, "my name is Ray Cole. I was a DEA field agent in Houston from 1988 to 2001. I held his gaze. "I built the operation that put you and Sandra Maddox on in 1992. "I know," I said. This was not an interrogation. This was different in every way that mattered. Miguel Ruiz looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I have coffee." "I know," I said. "I'm trying to understand what that means." "Sandra called me," he said. "Last night. She said you might come." "She didn't tell me she called you. What did you decide?" "No." The faintest shift in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Sandra doesn't telegraph. She never did." He looked at his coffee cup. "She said you were trying to do the right thing. She said I should decide for myself what that was worth." He poured 2 cups without asking how I took mine. He'd been alone long enough that he'd forgotten to ask. I drank it black, which was how it came, and said nothing while he sat across from me at the kitchen table and organized himself into stillness. The inside of the house was ordered and simple. A man's space, functional, with the specific neatness of someone who has learned to keep their environment manageable because other things have not been. Books on a shelf above the television, mostly history, and 1 shelf of paperback fiction. A work table near the back window with half-finished wood pieces on it. Small carvings, the kind of detailed, patient work that requires long hours and a quiet mind. The question landed in the kitchen. Insanely, Jesse's phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I'd taken it at his insistence. He'd wanted me reachable. I looked at the screen. "I'm not here for your forgiveness," I said. "I want to be clear about that. What I did in 1992 was legal, and it was wrong at the same time. And I spent 32 years not saying that to the people it mattered most to say it to. I'm saying it now because it's true, and because it's overdue. Not because it changes anything." "Yes." She looked at her hands for a moment. He usually was. I set the phone face up on the table so Miguel could read it. "You know what I thought about most?" he said finally. "Not in the beginning. In the beginning, I thought about all the things you'd expect. But later, after the first 10 years, what I kept coming back to was, what kind of man is he now?" He looked at me steadily. "Not what kind of man he was then. What kind of man he became
He looked at the phone for another moment. Then at me, I nodded. That was honest. That was more than I'd had any right to expect. He read it slowly. His expression didn't shift dramatically. It was the expression of a man receiving news he has wanted for a long time and has learned not to let himself feel too quickly in case it isn't real. I sat with the question long enough that the coffee went cold. Miguel was quiet for a moment. The portable fan in the window moved the Gulf air through the kitchen in slow, regular pulses. "What kind of man did you become?" he said again. Quiet, level, without accusation. A genuine question from a man who had been thinking about it for 32 years and wanted the actual answer. He looked at me directly. I decided to open the door. A pause. The rest I'm still working on. Miguel looked at me without judgment. "And now I became a man who is good at his work," I said finally, "and careful about everything else. I retired with a clean record and a service commendation, and no one in my personal life who knew what I'd actually done. I told myself that was discipline." I paused. "It was cowardice dressed in bright clothes." He nodded. The nod of a man who finds an answer acceptable, not because it's complete, but because it's honest. Miguel didn't push. He had the patience of a man who had learned that silence is not absence. It's a form of presence that most people are too uncomfortable to maintain. He'd learned it somewhere between 1992 and now, in the specific school that has no name and charges tuition no one chooses to pay. "She'll be cleared," I said. "Sandra, the record will be corrected. Miguel, your name is in the documentation. Walsh knows your testimony to be significant." "What kind of man did you become?" I said. He gestured toward the work-room microphone. Small wood carvings, a pelican, a lighthouse, a hand rendered open by dark sea. A man who found use for the years he was given, even when he hadn't chosen to make one. A pause. "That's not virtue. That's just refusal. The specific refusal to let what was done to you be the only thing that defines you." I started carving in the air. The guard brought in a block of cedar for the workshop program. By year 12, I was teaching other men. He looked at me steadily. "I'm not telling you this so you feel better about what you did. I'm telling you because you asked what kind of man I became. And this is the answer." I thought about 33 years of burying a seal in the basement of the city. The difference between that and what Miguel had just described was simpler than I'd made it, and harder, and more available than I'd allowed myself to believe. I opened my mouth. "Sandra distracted," Miguel said, and found, for the first time in longer than I could account for, that I didn't know what to say. Not because I was evading the answer, but because I was, at 63 years old, in a white house 4 blocks from the Gulf of Mexico, genuinely uncertain of the truth. Miguel laughed. Sure, genuine. The laugh of a man who doesn't do it often, and means it when he does. At some point, Jesse unclasped the Seiko from his wrist and set it on the table between them without speaking. Miguel looked at it for a long moment. He touched the crystal face with one finger. The gesture of a man touching something he didn't expect to see. They sat at the kitchen table. I stood near the window and watched the Gulf light water through the blocks. The conversation between them had the quality of two people meeting across a distance that wasn't geographic. Jesse, with his Edward The weight of a mission. The weight of a history, understood and accepted. What kind of man are you becoming? Hero, he said. Edward gave it to you because he trusted you. I trust his judgment. He looked at Jesse directly. Now you know where it came from and what it cost. That's what matters. Not what kind you were. Not what kind you failed. I turned back. Golf was kind of man are you becoming? I opened my notebook to the page where I'd written one line in Miguel Ruiz's kitchen, 4 blocks from the Gulf of Mexico. Then I wrote the next line. It was the same question Miguel had asked in a different form. What kind of man are you becoming? What are you going to do? The question points in the same direction, regardless of how it goes. Jesse looked at the heart. Carol offered me a position in research and documentation for a wrongful conviction advocacy group she's advising. We paused. It's not well paid. Below it, I wrote the date. Below the date, I wrote the first sentence of the thing I needed to write. Not a confession, not an apology, but an account. Honest, complete, stated plainly in the first person by the man who had been there. Not redemption, not absolution. And in a South Boston apartment, at a kitchen table, a 63-year-old man was writing the first honest sentence of the rest of his life. Wash called me last week, Jesse said. She wants a formal deposition for the civil suit. Sandra's filing against the DEA for wrongful prosecution. Yes, it is. I looked at the sentence for a long time. Outside, the Boston night settled over the city. The patient permanence of the thing that has been here longer than any of us. It will remain after we're done with our particular version of the story. The street below was quiet. Somewhere in Houston, a federal case was making its slow institutional way towards something that resembled justice. Somewhere in Corpus Christi, a man was teaching other men to find the shape inside the world. Somewhere in Providence, a young man with a worn Seiko watch on his wrist was beginning the work that Edward Maddox had spent 5 years making possible. Jesse was quiet for a moment, watching a container ship move slowly through the outer harbor. The Seiko watch was on his wrist, where it had been since Miguel's kitchen table. Different weight now, different meaning. Jesse arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He knocked with the same quiet confidence he brought to every door since Providence. Miguel opened and looked at him the way a man looks at someone he's been looking and is now measuring against the description. In January of 1992, I built a DEA operation that I knew was legally sound and morally wrong. And I built it anyway because it was easier than the alternative. Just the man becoming.